Sometimes the smallest door opens onto the biggest mercy. The cold had settled over Pine Hollow before sunrise, laying a thin silver film across the fields and turning every fence post into a quiet little monument. At the edge of town, where the road bent past the grain silo and the old church steeple, a veteran named Eli Mercer stood with one gloved hand resting on the back of his German shepherd, Boone, and looked at the house everyone else had already decided was worthless. It sat alone beneath a pair of bare maple trees, a weathered farmhouse with faded white paint, a sagging porch, and windows that caught the morning light like tired eyes trying not to close. Eli did not own a home, not really. He had spent the last 2 winters moving between borrowed couches, church basements, and the cab of an old pickup truck that barely deserved the name. His coat was clean but thin, his boots had been stitched twice, and the silence around him carried the weight of 1,000 hard years. Still, Boone's tail moved once, slow and certain, as if the dog had already sensed something waiting inside the stillness. In veteran stories, people often remember the dramatic moments, the grand rescues, the sudden turns of fate, but real life rarely announces its miracles so loudly. Sometimes grace arrives as a folded key, a short note, and the kind of chance that only feels impossible until it happens to you. The note had been handed to Eli the evening before by Mrs. Wren Holbrook, the town's oldest widow, a woman so small she seemed made of winter light and old prayers. She had asked him to fix the broken railing on her porch, and he had done it without asking for anything in return, kneeling in the snow while Boone sat beside him like a quiet shadow. When he finished, she pressed the envelope into his hand with a look so steady it almost felt like she could see the future. Inside was a deed, a brass key, and 3 words written in careful blue ink, "For the kind man." No one in Pine Hollow understood why she had chosen him, and most of them didn't bother pretending to. At the diner, the men in wool caps had already started their soft, skeptical whispers. At the feed store, someone had said the place was probably falling apart from the inside. Even the banker, with his polished shoes and careful smile, had asked twice if Eli was certain he wanted to take on that burden. But Boone had lifted his head the moment they turned onto the property lane, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on the front steps as if the dog recognized a memory hidden in the wood. Eli climbed out slowly and shut the truck door with a quiet thud. The sound seemed to echo farther than it should have, traveling through the bare trees and into the house itself. He walked up the porch boards, each one giving a soft complaint beneath his boots, and stood before the locked front door. The brass key felt warm in his palm, and for a brief moment he thought of all the doors in his life that had stayed closed too long. Then he looked down at Boone, who had gone still, nose lifted toward the scene beneath the frame, and Eli understood that whatever waited inside this place was not meant to be found by force, but by trust. He slid the key into the lock. Somewhere deep in the house, something gave a faint, patient click. The lock turned with a soft, reluctant sigh, and Eli felt Boone shift beside him as if the dog had been waiting for that exact sound all along. He opened the door slowly, letting the cold air from inside drift across his face first. It carried the scent of dust, old pine, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like dried lavender left too long in a drawer. The hallway beyond was dim, but not dark. Winter light slipped through narrow windows and laid pale rectangles across the worn floorboards, revealing a home that had not been loved in years, yet had somehow remained patient through all of them. Eli stood still for a moment, one hand on the door, the other resting lightly against Boone's neck. The dog did not rush in. He stepped forward with careful intent, nails tapping once, then stopping, his head lowered as if he were listening to a voice only he could hear. Eli followed him inside. The air was colder than outside, but there was a strange stillness in it, not empty, exactly, but waiting. On the small table near the entryway sat a ceramic bowl with a blue flower painted around its rim, and beside it was a framed photograph turned face down. A thin coat of dust covered everything, yet the room still held a sense of order, like someone had left in a hurry and expected to return. Eli moved farther in, his boots whispering over the wood. Boone's ears twitched at a sound from deeper in the house, a single muted creak that seemed to rise from the back of the hallway. The dog stopped and looked toward it, body rigid, tail low but steady. Eli followed his gaze. There was a narrow staircase at the end of the hall, the kind built long before anyone thought about convenience, with handrails worn smooth by generations of palms. Halfway up the wall hung a row of small brass hooks, and beneath them a faded quilt was folded over the back of a chair, as though someone had paused for just a moment and never come back to finish the day. Eli ran his fingers along the banister. It was clean beneath the dust, polished in a few places by years of use. That told him more than any paperwork could. This had once been a lived-in place, a place where somebody had brewed coffee before sunrise, where shoes had waited by the door, where a life had moved through every room with purpose. He and Boone stepped into the sitting room first. A stone fireplace stood on the far wall, its hearth stacked with old ash and a few blackened bits of wood. Above it hung a sun-faded landscape painting of a river lined with birches, and for a moment Eli felt as if the house were remembering itself through that image. A couch sat under the window, covered in a white sheet gone yellow with time. Beside it, a small radio rested on a side table, its dial cracked but still intact. Eli reached out and touched it lightly, as if expecting it to hum under his fingertips. Instead, he found only silence. Boone moved to the window and stared out across the yard, where the grass had turned the color of old straw and the bare branches of the maple swayed in the wind. Then, without warning, the dog let out a low, measured sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something in between, the kind of warning that made Eli's spine tighten. He crossed to Boone at once and looked where the dog was looking. At first he saw nothing but the edge of the porch and the long drift of winter shadows. Then he noticed it. A narrow line in the wall near the window frame, almost invisible beneath the paint, like a seam in the wood that did not belong there. Boone's nose dipped toward it, and his paws shifted once, carefully, as if he had found a scent worth guarding. Eli crouched beside him and studied the panel. It was built into the wall so neatly that anyone else might have mistaken it for decoration. But the old house had a way of revealing itself in pieces, and this was one of them. He pressed lightly along the edge. Nothing. Then a little lower, where the wood had bowed almost imperceptibly with age, and a faint click answered beneath his fingers. Boone's ears rose. Eli held his breath. The panel did not open, not yet, but the sound had been enough to change the room. Somewhere in the house, a second sound followed, softer this time, like metal touching metal from far below the floorboards. Eli looked up at the ceiling, then back at Boone. The dog stood perfectly still, eyes fixed not on the wall, but on the space beneath it, as if the secret was not in front of them but waiting under their feet. Eli rose slowly, his pulse calm but deep, and let his palm rest against the wall one more time. He had spent enough years learning that some things only opened when the person asking was willing to be patient. He glanced around the room again, taking in the fireplace, the covered furniture, the old radio, the turned photograph, all the quiet evidence of a life paused rather than ended. There was no fear in him now, only the kind of solemn wonder that comes when a man realizes the world may still keep one more gift hidden inside its silence. Boone stepped closer to the wall and gave it one careful sniff, then looked back at Eli with an expression so intent it almost felt human. Eli gave a small nod, more to himself than to the dog. Whatever this place held, it had waited a long time to be found. And if the house had chosen this moment to speak, then he would listen. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low, steady murmur. Inside, the old walls seemed to hold their breath. For the first time since arriving, Eli felt that the house was not simply sheltering them. It was inviting them deeper. Boone moved first, padding softly across the floorboards as if he understood the need for silence. Eli followed the dog toward the side of the room, where the dim light from the window fell across a stretch of paneled wall that looked no different from the rest at first glance. But once Boone stopped there, his nose pressed close to the wood, Eli could see it too, a faint seam, nearly erased by age and paint, running down beside the mantel. The veteran crouched, running his fingers along the line. It was warm only with the lingering memory of summer, but it was there, a hidden edge where one piece of the house gave way to another. He pressed once, then twice, and the panel gave the smallest inward shift. Eli held his breath. A narrow latch, dark with rust and time, sat behind the trim. He had the feeling that whoever built this place had never meant for it to be opened by accident. Boone whined softly, not in fear, but in urgency, as though he had been waiting for Eli to notice what he already knew. Eli looked over his shoulder at the room behind them. The covered sofa, the old lamp, the silent radio, the photograph turned face down on the table. All of it seemed to belong to one frozen moment long ago, when somebody had closed a door and expected the world to forget it. But the house had not forgotten. It had simply waited. He reached for the latch, then stopped. For a long moment, he just stood there with his hands suspended in the air, listening to the old boards settle and the wind breathe against the eaves. Something in him understood that the next step would change the shape of this night. Not danger, exactly. Not yet. More like a truth that had been patient for too long. Boone nudged his knee, and Eli let out a slow breath through his nose. "All right, boy," he murmured, the words low and steady. "Let us see what you found." The latch resisted at first, then turned with a dry metallic click that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Eli eased the panel open just enough for a line of darkness to appear beyond it. A faint smell drifted out, old cedar, dust, and something paper-thin beneath it, the scent of a place that had been sealed away from light and air for years. Boone leaned forward, ears alert, but did not rush in. Eli admired that restraint. He had seen plenty of dogs act on instinct alone, but Boone always seemed to know when to wait for the man beside him to catch up. Eli fetched the flashlight from his coat pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the opening and found a narrow passage no wider than his shoulders, framed by worn boards and a staircase that descended into the house itself, deep beneath the room they stood in. Not a crawl space. Not a cellar in the usual sense. It was too deliberate for that. Steps, hand-cut and steep, disappeared into shadow. Along the wall, he caught the glint of something metal, a pipe, or perhaps a railing, coated in dust so thick it looked as though no hand had touched it in half a century. Eli swallowed and glanced at Boone. The dog was staring into the darkness with a stillness that felt almost reverent. The beam traveled lower. At the bottom of the first turn, it caught the edge of a landing, and there, resting against the wall, was a tin box with a faded label that time had nearly erased. Eli could not read the words from where he stood, but he saw enough to know it had been placed there on purpose. Not forgotten. Preserved. Waiting. He felt the old familiar tension rise in his chest, not the sharp edge of fear, but the quiet weight of responsibility. Whatever was down there had belonged to someone who believed it mattered enough to hide, and enough to survive. He thought of the woman in the photograph upstairs, the careful way the room had been arranged, the closed drapes, the covered furniture. A life paused, not ended. Maybe that was what this was too. Not a secret meant to keep people out, but a message meant for the right person at the right time. Boone took one step onto the first stair and looked back as if asking permission. Eli nodded once. The dog moved down slowly, his nails clicking softly against the wood. Eli followed, one hand on the railing, the flashlight beam trembling only a little as it found the next step and the next. The air grew cooler with each foot they descended. The house above them seemed to fade, replaced by the hush of something older, deeper, and strangely gentle. Then, halfway down, Eli heard it. Not a voice. Not quite. Just the faintest sound from below, a soft ticking, measured and patient, as if somewhere in the dark a forgotten clock had been keeping time for years, waiting for someone to finally listen. The ticking grew clearer as Eli and Boone descended into the cool dark beneath the house, each step carrying them farther from the dim glow of the kitchen above. The air changed first. It lost the dry scent of old pine and dust and took on something quieter, older, like iron, paper, and the faint trace of candle wax that had long since settled into the walls. Eli moved slowly, the flashlight in his hand painting narrow circles across stone steps worn smooth by years of use. Boone stayed close, his shoulder brushing Eli's leg now and then, steady as a heartbeat. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a narrow cellar lined with shelves that leaned under the weight of time. Jars with faded labels stood in silent rows. A cracked lantern rested beside folded cloth. Bundles of old newspapers were tied with string and stacked neatly against one wall, as if someone had once meant to return for them and never did. But the ticking did not come from any of that. Boone stopped near the far corner and lifted his head. His ears angled forward. Then he gave a low, patient sound, not a bark, not a growl, just enough to tell Eli that the answer was close. Eli followed the dog's gaze to a tall cabinet at the end of the cellar, its doors shut and its brass handle dulled by age. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb the stillness, and saw that the cabinet was not empty at all. It had been padded with folded blankets, and behind them, tucked into the back panel, was a small square clock no larger than a dinner plate. Its face was yellowed with age, its Numbers thin and delicate, but the hands were moving. Slow. Steady. Faithful. Eli stood there for a long moment, listening. The soft ticking filled the cellar like a whisper someone had kept alive for decades. He reached out, then stopped. There was something deeply tender about it, as if this clock had not simply been forgotten. It had been waiting. Waiting for footsteps on the stairs. Waiting for a light in the dark. Waiting for someone willing to notice that time had not stopped here, only hidden itself away. Boone pressed his nose against the cabinet door and sniffed once. Then he turned and trotted toward the opposite wall, where the flashlight caught a narrow seam in the stone. Eli frowned and walked over. At first it looked like nothing more than a crack in the foundation. But when he brushed away the dust, his fingers found the edge of a metal plate set flush into the wall. It was painted over, nearly invisible, and anchored with small screws that had rusted soft with age. Eli looked back at Boone, who sat down with calm certainty, as if he had known all along. With a careful breath, Eli knelt and worked one of the screws loose with the tip of his pocket knife. The metal gave way with a faint sigh. Behind the plate was a shallow recess, just deep enough to hold a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Eli lifted it out and felt the weight of it in his hands. Not heavy like money. Heavy like meaning. He carried the bundle to the work table near the stairs and unfolded the cloth under the flashlight beam. Inside was a stack of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, a slim ledger, and a photograph that had been handled so many times the edges had softened into curves. The image showed a younger man standing in front of the same house, one hand resting on the porch rail, the other on the shoulder of a little girl. The porch looked new in the picture. The trees were smaller. The sky was bright with summer. Yet something in the man's face made Eli go still. It was not just familiarity. It was recognition without memory, like hearing a song from childhood and knowing every note before the chorus begins. He opened the ledger first. The handwriting was neat, careful. Almost formal. Names. Dates. Small entries marked in the margin. Expenses for lumber. Payments for repairs. A note about the clock below. A reference to the stairwell. And then, near the last page, a line that made Eli's throat tighten: "Keep this place ready. When the right man comes, he will need more than shelter." Eli looked up, the words hanging between him and Boone like a prayer neither of them had expected. He read the line again, slower this time, and felt something shift deep inside him. It was not fear. It was not confusion. It was the quiet, uneasy feeling of standing too close to a truth that had been arranging his life long before he arrived here. Upstairs, the house settled with a soft creak, as if it too had heard what was being uncovered below. Boone rose and moved to Eli's side, his tail low, his eyes fixed on the papers in the veteran's hands. Eli reached for one of the letters, broke the seal carefully, and began to read. The first lines were written in a voice that felt intimate and worn with time, a voice that knew loss, endurance, and the stubborn beauty of keeping faith when life gave little reason to. By the third sentence, Eli understood that this was not just a forgotten cache left behind by accident. It was a message. A deliberate one. Left by someone who had seen more than one hard winter, someone who had believed that kindness would eventually find its way back to the door it once helped open. And in that cellar, with the clock still ticking softly behind him, Eli finally felt the truth settling into place. The house had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for him. The cellar felt different now. Not warmer, exactly, but changed in a way that Eli could not explain. The soft ticking of the old clock seemed to settle into the walls, and the dust hanging in the air no longer looked lifeless. It drifted through the beam of Boone's flashlight like tiny sparks suspended in stillness. Eli stood with the letter in both hands, reading it again more slowly this time, as if a second look might reveal the shape of the person who had written it. Boone stayed close, his broad body pressed near Eli's leg, alert but calm, listening to every small sound the house made. Up above, a pipe gave a gentle creak. Somewhere in the ceiling, the wind moved through a gap in the wood inside like a tired breath. Eli glanced around the cellar and saw the old shelves, the jam jars, the stacked trunks, the low stone walls dark with age. For years, maybe decades, all of it had waited in silence. And now, after one careful sentence at a time, the silence had finally begun to speak. The handwriting in the letter was neat but uneven, as if it had been written by someone whose hands had grown unsteady with time. Eli traced the page with his eyes and found lines about winters that came early, about bread shared when there was barely enough for one, about a man who had once worked this farm and believed that the smallest acts of mercy were never wasted. There was no bitterness in those words. Only memory. Only a quiet trust that what had been given away in love would somehow return when the moment was right. Eli swallowed hard and looked down at Boone, whose ears shifted toward the stairway for a brief second before settling again. The dog had sensed something before he had. He always did. Eli folded the paper gently and reached for the next envelope. It rested beneath the first like a promise waiting to be opened. This one was tied with faded blue ribbon, the color nearly gone with age. On the front, in the same careful hand, was written only one name, Eli Mercer. His own name. Seeing it there sent a quiet pulse through his chest. He sat down on the bottom step, the wood cool beneath him, and broke the ribbon. Inside was another letter, thinner than the first, along with a small photograph that had yellowed at the edges. Eli lifted the photo into the light. It showed the farmhouse in another era, the porch newly painted, the garden alive with tall sunflowers, and standing in the doorway was a woman he did not know, smiling softly at the camera. In her hands was a basket of peaches. Beside her stood a young boy with a serious face and a dog that looked startlingly like Boone, only younger and leaner, as if time itself had reached backward and touched the image. Eli felt the breath leave him in a slow exhale. The letter explained that the woman in the photograph had been the last true keeper of the house, and that the farm had been more than land. It had been shelter for travelers during hard years, a place where food had been left on porches without names attached, a place where people who had nowhere else to go had found rest. The writer spoke of his mother, of her habit of leaving lanterns burning when storms came through, of the way she believed that no person should ever be made to feel forgotten at their lowest hour. Eli read that part twice, then lowered the page and stared at the cellar wall. He thought of all the times life had felt like a long road with no destination, of the long stretch after the army, the jobs that never lasted, the rooms he could not afford, the nights when Boone had been the only steady thing in a world that kept shifting under him. And now here he was, sitting in a hidden cellar beneath a farmhouse he had almost never entered, reading the words of strangers who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. Boone gave a low, soft huff and nudged the edge of the photograph with his nose. Eli smiled faintly, then looked farther down inside the box. There was one more envelope, thicker than the others, sealed with red wax that had long since cracked. He did not open it right away. Instead, he held it in both hands and listened. Not just to the house, but to himself. To the steadied beat of his own heart. To the strange feeling that the life he had lived until now had been leading him here all along, to this cellar, to this quiet, to this moment when the past was finally no longer hidden. Above him, the old clock marked another minute, and the sound seemed almost like approval. Eli finally broke the seal. Inside was a folded page and a key wrapped in cloth so fragile it nearly dissolved at his touch. The key was long and dark, with an ornate bow and a bite of rust along the teeth. Tucked beneath it was a note written in the same careful hand: "If you have reached this point, then the house has accepted you, and the rest belongs to you now." Eli stared at the words while Boone shifted beside him, the dog's gaze moving from the key to the stairway above, as if he understood that something larger had just begun. The house had not only been waiting. It had been preparing to reveal the truth in its own time. And somewhere beyond the cellar, beyond the worn floorboards and the sleeping rooms and the weathered porch, something else was waiting to be opened. The key felt heavier than it should have in Eli's palm, as if it carried not just age but memory. Boone stayed close to his side while he turned the little brass shape over once, then again, studying the worn notches and the dark sheen of rust that clung to the teeth. The note had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. If you have reached this point, then the house has accepted you. There was something almost tender in those words, almost solemn, and Eli stood very still in the cellar with the cold rising through the stone floor and the hush of the old house pressing gently around him. Above, the clock kept breathing its quiet, measured beat. Boone lifted his head toward the stairway, ears pricked, and Eli followed that instinct without knowing why. The dog was not restless, only certain, and that certainty moved through Eli like a soft and steady hand. He tucked the key into his coat pocket, extinguished the lantern, and started up the narrow stairs. Each step answered with a low wooden sigh, as though the house itself recognized the weight of what he carried. By the time he reached the kitchen, evening had deepened outside the windows, and the pale gray light from the yard stretched across the floor in long, thin bands. The kitchen was modest and still, built from the same tired bones as the rest of the place, yet something in it felt different now. Not warmer exactly, but awake. Eli set the lantern on the table and looked toward the old mantel clock, then toward the pantry door beside it. Boone went there first, placing his nose against the painted wood, then stepping back and looking at Eli with a steady, patient expression that seemed almost purposeful. Eli frowned softly and crossed the room. The pantry had seemed ordinary before. Just a narrow storage space with shelves lined in jars, folded cloth, and old tins. But now, with the key in his pocket and the note still buzzing quietly in his mind, he noticed the brass lock beneath the handle. It had been hidden so neatly in the paint and shadow that he had not seen it before. He drew the key out with careful fingers and slid it in. It turned at once. The click was gentle, but it moved through the room like a bell heard from far away. Boone gave a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, just a soft breath of attention. Eli opened the pantry door. It swung inward to reveal not shelves of canned goods, but a narrow passage lined with aged wallpaper, its pattern faded to the color of old rain. At the far end, another door waited. Smaller. Older. Painted the same tired cream as the walls, with a black iron handle worn smooth by hands that had once opened it often. Eli stood there in silence, the key still warm from his hand. Boone moved past his leg and sat beside the threshold, eyes fixed on the little door as if guarding something sacred. Eli's throat tightened. He did not know what lay beyond, but the air had changed. It smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and something else he could not name, something like papers that had slept for years in the dark. He reached for the handle, paused, and then glanced down at Boone. The dog looked back without blinking, calm and unwavering, as if to say that whatever waited on the other side was meant to be faced, not feared. Eli let out a slow breath and pushed the door open. A small room emerged from the darkness, no larger than a bedroom closet, though its walls had been carefully fitted with shelves from floor to ceiling. There were ledgers bound in cracked leather, tin boxes labeled in fading ink, and several thick envelopes stacked in neat rows. On a narrow table near the back sat a framed photograph turned face down and a black iron box secured with another tiny lock. Eli stepped inside slowly, the floorboard beneath him giving a soft complaint. The room felt untouched by time, preserved with the quiet devotion of someone who had known its importance. He ran his fingertips along the edge of one shelf, then opened the nearest ledger. The pages were covered in the same careful handwriting as the note, lines of dates, names, and numbers written with patience and precision. Boone sniffed the air once and settled near the doorway, content to keep watch. Eli kept reading until one sentence made him stop altogether. It referred to the house as if it had belonged not to a family, but to a promise. A promise to shelter, to preserve, and to return what had once been placed in trust. He turned another page and found references to a woman named Margaret Vale, to a winter storm decades earlier, to a child sent away for safety, and to a final instruction that the truth must remain hidden until the right man arrived. Eli sat down slowly on the edge of a stool, the ledger open in his hands. The room seemed to breathe around him. So much had been sealed here not for greed, but for waiting. Not for hiding forever, but for the moment when someone honest enough, patient enough, and gentle enough would arrive to carry it forward. He thought of the house in its long loneliness, of the note in the cellar, of Boone leading him as if by an invisible thread, and he felt something deep within him loosen. For years he had moved through the world as if he were only passing through it, asking for little, expecting less. But here, among dust and ink and sleeping names, he understood that some places do not simply keep secrets. They keep faith. Boone rose and came to his side just as Eli reached for the black iron box. The lock was small and delicate, and the key from below fit it perfectly. Inside was not gold, not money, not anything the outside world would have called valuable at first glance. There were letters. Dozens of them, tied in faded ribbon, each one addressed to a name Eli did not know and each one signed with the same trembling hand. Beneath the letters lay a deed, old but official, naming Eli as the legal recipient of the property, the land, and everything the house had held in trust. He stared at the papers while the lamp flame shivered once and steadied again. Boone touched his knee with the side of his head, and Eli rested a hand against the dog's neck, feeling the warmth there, the life, the loyalty that had brought him this far. It was not wealth that knelt before him in that room. It was remembrance. It was the final act of a kindness given long ago, waiting patiently to find its way home. And in the quiet that followed, with the little room glowing in the last of the evening light, Eli finally understood that some inheritances are not measured in acres or money, but in trust, mercy, and the unseen hands that guide a broken life back toward purpose. The first pale light of morning slipped across the cracked windows and settled over Eli's kitchen like a quiet blessing. The little house, which had once felt empty enough to echo with every breath, now held the soft sounds of a kettle warming on the stove and Boone's slow nails tapping across the wooden floor. Eli stood by the sink with his hands braced on the edge, looking out at the yard where frost still clung to the grass in silver patches. The deed lay folded on the table behind him, as real and steady as the sunrise, and yet it still felt impossible that the land, the house, and everything tucked beneath its old boards now belonged to him. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the trembling handwriting in the letters and felt again the strange weight of being chosen by someone long gone. Boone came to his side and pressed his shoulder gently against Eli's leg, and Eli lowered a hand to the dog's head, running his fingers through the warm fur behind one ear. "You knew," he murmured, his voice rough from a night of silence. Boone answered with a soft exhale, his eyes calm and watchful, as if he had understood the truth long before Eli ever could. By mid-morning, Eli had taken the old iron kettle off the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, though he only held one for himself. The second he carried to the front room and set near the chair where Mr. Harlan had once sat in the fading light, reading those letters with careful hands. There was something about the room that felt changed now. Not brighter, exactly. More honest. As if the walls had finally stopped hiding what they had carried for so many years. Eli sat in the chair and let the silence gather around him. Outside, a light wind moved through the bare trees, brushing the branches together like distant fingers. The sound brought back a memory he had nearly forgotten, his own mother on a cold winter evening, humming softly while she mended a torn sleeve by lamplight. She had always believed that kindness was never wasted, even when nobody saw where it went. He had not understood that when he was younger. He understood it now. Around noon, he carried a lantern down to the cellar door and stared at the narrow stairs leading beneath the house. Boone stood beside him at once, ears forward, tail still, waiting for the next step. Eli took a long breath and began down. The cellar was cooler than the rooms above, with an earthy smell of stone, dust, and old wood. He moved slowly, the lantern swinging in his hand, and Boone stayed close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Along the far wall, half hidden behind a row of crates, Eli noticed the stone foundation where the floor dipped slightly, as though one section had been repaired long ago and forgotten. He crouched, brushed away dust with his palm, and found the edge of a small metal ring set into the boards. It was old, nearly the same color as the wood around it, and would have been easy to miss if the morning sun had not come in at the right angle through the cellar window. Boone made a low sound, not a bark but something quieter, a note of warning and curiosity woven together. Eli set the lantern down and pulled on the ring. The board lifted with a tired groan, revealing a narrow compartment below the floor. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since gone soft with age, was a tin box the size of a bread loaf. He lifted it out carefully, almost afraid the slightest pressure might turn it to dust. When he opened the lid, he found a stack of photographs, a slim notebook, and a small brass key tied with twine. The photographs were black and white, the edges curled, but the faces were clear enough. There was Mr. Harlan, younger by decades, standing beside a woman Eli did not know, both of them smiling at something just outside the frame. There were children at the edge of a lake, a barn in summer, a long porch draped in vines, and Boone, or a dog very much like Boone, sitting proudly beside a man in a work coat. Eli turned each picture slowly, feeling the past rise gently from the paper. The notebook was filled with names, dates, little accounts of repairs, gifts given, meals shared, and promises kept. It was not a ledger of money. It was a ledger of mercy. Page after page, it recorded small acts that had once seemed unimportant: a sack of flour left on a widow's steps, a coat mended for a boy who had nothing warm to wear, firewood split for a family whose strength had run out before winter ended. And beneath many of the entries was the same phrase, written in that trembling hand: "Someday this will find its way back." Eli sat back on his heels, the lantern light trembling across his face. He did not know how long he remained there, reading and rereading, but at some point Boone settled beside him on the cellar floor and rested his chin on Eli's knee. The dog's steady warmth kept him from sinking too deeply into the strange ache blooming in his chest. What Mr. Harlan had left behind was more than a house. It was a life told in acts of quiet devotion, a hidden testimony to the truth that every kindness leaves a mark, even when time buries it deep. When Eli finally returned upstairs, the afternoon sun was leaning west, spilling gold across the kitchen table. He placed the notebook beside the letters and the photographs, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine that he had not arrived here by accident. Perhaps hunger had led him to that fence line. Perhaps Boone had not merely smelled a trail, but a promise. Perhaps some roads exist only to carry a man to the place where his life can begin again. That evening, he carried a chair out to the porch and sat with Boone at his feet while the sky softened into lavender over the fields. The air smelled of cut wood and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door shut. A wind chime spoke once, then twice, in a melody so gentle it seemed almost like a prayer. Eli looked out over the land. He was only just beginning to know, and for the first time in many years, he did not feel like a man standing at the end of something. He felt, quietly and without warning, like someone who had been given back to himself. And as Boone lifted his head and watched the darkening horizon with those steady, knowing eyes, Eli understood that some miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. Some arrive as a key, a notebook, a loyal dog, and a door that finally opens after years of waiting. By the time dawn touched the windows, the house no longer felt quite as empty as it had the night before. There was still silence, but it was a different kind now, softer and easier to breathe inside. Eli rose before the sun, as he always did, and found Boone already awake, sitting near the back door with his ears lifted toward the yard as if he were listening for something beneath the ordinary sounds of morning. The kettle on the stove began to murmur, and the first light of day slipped across the kitchen table, resting on the old notebook like a hand laid gently on a shoulder. Eli poured himself a cup of coffee, then stood for a long moment looking at the pages he had read so many times already. The names, the dates, the careful notes in Marion Lyle's hand, all of it had begun to feel less like the remains of a forgotten life and more like an invitation. Outside, the fields were wet with dew, and the barn roof shone faintly beneath a sky the color of pale steel. Eli slipped into his coat, called Boone softly, and stepped out into the crisp morning air with the notebook tucked beneath his arm. The lane down to the old chapel was still muddy from the rain, and every step carried the faint smell of earth waking up. Boone walked close, his tail low and steady, pausing now and then to glance toward the trees as though checking that the world was still holding together. Eli had expected fear when he returned to the place, but what he felt instead was something quieter, something almost like reverence. The little chapel sat where it always had, tucked beneath the oaks, its white paint weathered to the color of bone and milk, its bell tower leaning just slightly toward the east. Ivy clung to the bricks near the foundation, and the front steps were slick with damp leaves. Yet the door, though old, was no longer a barrier in his mind. It had become a threshold. He reached the porch, set his hand against the wood, and felt the cool rough grain beneath his fingers. For a moment he simply stood there, listening. No voices. No engines. No hurried footsteps. Only the wind moving through the branches and the soft breathing of the dog beside him. Then he remembered the line hidden in Marion's notebook, written in the margin of a page that had otherwise seemed ordinary: beneath the place where prayers were once whispered, the truth waits in the quiet. Eli had read it again and again, never quite certain whether it pointed to a memory, a secret, or a kindness that had never been fully understood. Now, standing at the chapel door, he felt the meaning of it settle into him like warmth after a long winter. He tried the handle. It gave easily. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old wood, dust, and rainwater gathered somewhere out of sight. Sunlight slipped through the narrow stained glass windows and painted thin ribbons of color across the floorboards. Boone stepped in first, then stopped near the front pew, his nose lifting as though he had caught a trace of something hidden below the surface of the room. Eli followed, his boots making only the softest sound. Everything looked as it had before, and yet nothing felt the same. The broken hymnals still rested in a neat stack by the wall. The old altar still stood in the front, simple and worn. But now, with the notebook in his hand and Boone's quiet alertness filling the silence, Eli understood that this was not a place abandoned by God. It was a place waiting to be remembered. He moved toward the rear of the chapel, where the floorboards had long ago begun to settle unevenly. Boone stopped again, then lowered his head and let out a single, low whine, the kind of sound that always meant he was near something important. Eli knelt and ran his palm across the wood. One board near the far wall felt slightly different, the edge raised just enough to catch his fingernail. He tested it once, then again, and this time the board shifted with a faint, dry creak. Beneath it was a narrow seam, and beneath the seam, darkness. His breath caught. The notebook trembled in his hand as he crouched lower and looked into the space below the floor. There, tucked carefully into a shallow cavity, wrapped in cloth gone soft with age, was a small metal box no larger than a loaf of bread. It was dusted with rust but intact, and on the lid, etched by hand, was a single word, mercy. Eli did not open it right away. He sat back on his heels and stared, letting the weight of the moments settle around him. For years he had believed that life could only take, only strip away, only leave behind broken things. But there it was, hidden beneath the floor of a chapel that had nearly been forgotten, waiting patiently through all the seasons of silence. Boone nudged his knee once, then rested his head there, as if reminding him to keep breathing. Eli swallowed hard, his eyes stinging, and for the first time he smiled without forcing it. He understood then that some answers are not meant to arrive loudly. They come quietly, in a room filled with dust and light, in the patient turning of a key, in the loyal certainty of a dog who knows to wait. He placed the notebook on the pew, set one hand over the little box, and whispered a thank you that no one else could hear. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks with a sound like softened applause, and somewhere far off, a church bell began to ring from another part of the valley, faint and slow, as if the whole world had remembered to pray again. Eli looked toward the doorway, where morning light pooled across the threshold, and he knew that what waited inside that box would not only explain Marion's final years, but also the strange and tender path that had led him here. For the first time in a long while, the future no longer felt like a closed gate. It felt like something opening, inch by inch, into grace. The old box opened with a soft sigh, as if it had been waiting all these years for a hand willing to be gentle. Eli stood very still while the morning light spilled across the chapel floor and touched the little things inside one by one, a folded letter tied with faded blue ribbon, a pocket watch darkened by age, and a brass key wrapped in linen so carefully that it looked almost sacred. Marion's handwriting trembled across the first page, but her words were clear. She had not forgotten. She had not been afraid. And she had left behind more than memories. She had left a promise. Eli read without speaking, his lips moving only once or twice around names he had never heard before, names that seemed to belong to another century and yet had somehow been waiting for him all along. Beside him, Ranger sat with one ear lifted, his amber eyes fixed on Eli's face as if he understood that this was not simply a letter. This was a doorway. The note spoke of Marion's younger brother, of the orchard, of debts that had once threatened to take everything, and of a choice she had made in secret to protect the place from strangers who wanted to strip it bare. She wrote of a hidden room beneath the old parish hall, a room she had only entered twice in her life, where papers had been sealed inside a cedar chest and protected by a lock no one had touched in decades. The key in Eli's hand belonged to that lock. For a long moment he did not move. He only listened to the hush of the chapel, the distant creak of boards in the wind, and the slow breathing of the dog at his side. Then he folded the letter with great care and placed it back inside the box, as if returning a prayer to its place. "We are going downstairs," he said quietly, though he was not speaking only to Ranger. He looked once more at Marion's name, then at the narrow door beside the altar that led to the old steps under the chapel. Dust lay thick along the frame, and the brass knob had gone dull with age, but when Eli turned it, the latch moved without protest. The stairway below was narrow and cool, carrying the smell of stone, cedar, and thyme. Ranger descended first, steady and certain, his claws making small, measured sounds against the steps. Eli followed with the key clenched in his palm, each step carrying him deeper into the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. At the bottom, a single bulb hung from a wire overhead, and its weak yellow glow revealed a low room lined with shelves, old crates, and a chest of cedar wood resting against the far wall. The air inside was still, but not dead. It felt watched over. It felt kept. Eli knelt before the chest and slipped the key into the lock. For a moment he feared it would break, but the mechanism turned with a clean, patient click, and the lid lifted open as though the years had been holding their breath. Inside were ledgers, photographs, deeds, and a bundle of letters tied in white string. There were maps of the orchard with handwritten notes in the margins, and a bank envelope sealed but never sent. There was also a small tin box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, wrapped in oilcloth and marked with Marian's initials. Eli opened it last. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a gold signet ring and a folded document with a legal seal long faded but still visible. He looked down at the paper and felt the ground of his life shift quietly beneath him. Marian had not only preserved the orchard. She had secured it, protected it, and arranged for it to pass to the only person she trusted to keep it alive. The document named him. Not as a guest. Not as a caretaker. As heir. The word seemed too large for the room, too bright for the dim light overhead. Eli read it twice, then a third time, because some part of him still did not believe a life such as his could be answered with a gift so complete. He thought of cold nights on park benches, of doors that stayed closed, of mornings when he had wondered whether he had already outlived whatever purpose remained for him. And now here it was, not as charity, not as pity, but as a calling. The orchard, the chapel, the cottage beyond the tree line, and the land between them were his to tend, to keep, and to become worthy of in the quiet way he already knew how. Ranger pressed his muzzle gently against Eli's knee, and Eli smiled through the tears he had not meant to shed. He laughed once, very softly, as if relieved to find that his heart still knew how. Above them, the old chapel remained still, but something in it had changed. The silence no longer felt like waiting. It felt like blessing. When Eli climbed back up into the morning, the world seemed newly washed, as though the light itself had been listening. The wind moved through the orchard branches, touching the leaves with a sound like whispered approval. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the deed in one hand and Ranger at his side, and watched the sun begin to warm the path outside. Nothing about him looked different from a distance. The coat was still worn. The boots were still dusty. The dog was still old for a shepherd and quiet in the way only faithful creatures can be. But something inside him had settled into place. The loneliness that had followed him for years did not vanish all at once. It simply lost its power to define him. He turned toward the orchard, toward the rows of trees Marian had loved, and saw not an ending but a beginning shaped by memory, duty, and grace. There were repairs to make, papers to sort, branches to prune, and a future to learn how to live inside. Yet for the first time, those tasks no longer felt like burdens. They felt like stewardship. They felt like trust. Ranger trotted ahead, pausing now and then to look back and make sure Eli was still coming. The old dog had led him to the truth, but truth had not ended there. It had opened into something gentler. Something lasting. Something that could hold a wounded life without asking it to pretend it was never broken. As Eli crossed the yard, he thought of Marian's final kindness and the hidden room beneath the chapel, and he understood that some gifts are never truly about property at all. They are about being seen. They are about being chosen when the world had long ago stopped noticing. They are about being trusted to carry forward what others thought had been forgotten. And perhaps that was the deepest miracle of all. Not the inheritance itself, but the way it restored a man's sense that his life still mattered. By the time he reached the old house, the sunlight had climbed higher, and the windows had begun to glow. Eli stood at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, and let himself breathe in the scent of cedar, earth, and morning. Then he stepped inside, not as a stranger passing through, but as a man finally arriving where he had always been meant to belong. And in the quiet that followed, with Ranger lying at the hearth and the orchard breathing softly beyond the walls, Eli knew that kindness had not ended with Marian. It had simply changed shape and found its way back home.